Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. We are presenting off of a laptop here, so I'm sorry about the angle, but I'm going to try and stay in view. So today it is my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. George Karam as our Caron Law lecturer this year. Dr. Caron Law, as many in this room and on Zoom may know, was our program director from 2016 to 2022. The annual Caron Law Lecture Series was created last year as a special iteration of Grand Rounds, both to honor her legacy and also deliver a Grand Rounds topic that was selected by the residents and for the residents. The idea is to select someone whose expertise and passion in an emerging field transcends the limits of typical clinical medicine as it relates to the experiences of medical learners. We also invite our faculty to reflect on their own experiences as trainees and the vital role they play in our department and our school. I would say today, our residents nailed the assignment with the unanimous decision to host Dr. Karam. Dr. George H. Karam is the holder of the Paula Garvey Manship Chair for Medical Education in the Department of Internal Medicine at Louisiana State University's School of Medicine in New Orleans. He attended medical school at LSU, and he completed his internal medicine residency at the University of Alabama in Birmingham Medical Center in Birmingham, Alabama. After serving as chief medical resident, which I had the distinct pleasure to hear about today, he did an infectious disease fellowship at that same institution. He is a diplomat in internal medicine and infectious disease from the American Board of Internal Medicine. From 2008 to 2013, he was chairman of the ABIM subspecialty board on infectious disease. He was program director of the LSU internal medicine residency from 1990 to 2019. Since 2019, he has been assistant dean for Baton Rouge Medical Education for the LSU School of Medicine in New Orleans Baton Rouge Regional Campus. Dr. Karam's scientific focus has been on the clinical aspects of bacterial resistance, with recent emphasis on antimicrobial stewardship. His work in medical education has been on the development of personal elements of professionalism and humanism in trainees. Specifically, he has begun the Paula Garvey Manship Humanism Project, which includes the development of a curriculum and educational guide for his medical school. And I speak for all of us when I say how excited we are to hear more about this work today. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. George H. Karam to the podium.
Thank you all very much for this wonderful invitation. I am 41 years into my academic career. And this is the first time that I have been specifically invited at the request of residents to talk about something that is geared toward what you want to hear. And so at the end of 41 years, as I reflect back over all the professional things that happen, I realize that we sometimes come up a little bit short in other arenas. And so I'm excited to be able to share with you my reflections over a 4-decade-long career. But I need to give you my disclaimer before we get started with that. Let's see, it's not moving.
They should work now.
Okay. In 1889, Sir William Osler gave the valedictory address at Penn. It was called Equanimitas. And it's a wonderful address, but in it, he makes a specific comment. He said, "In seeking absolute truth, we aim at the unattainable and must be content with finding broken portions." I'm going to tell you, I will not be able to give you a definitive answer today about how to find meaning and joy. But what I hopefully will give you are some insights and some perspectives that will help you to be able to address this in a really important way. Over the recent years of my career, I've become a very big believer that we sometimes hold off the ending too long. And so if you will indulge me, I'd like to start with the ending at the beginning. And what I'd like to do is I'd love to give you what the one underpinning element is that I believe is probably the most important thing if you're going to find meaning and joy in your training period. And I would say that is going to be connection. It is connection to peers, it's connection to patients, but very importantly, it is connection to self. And we sometimes get so busy telling you about milestones and epic things to meet that we forget to tell you about the importance of these things. So we will look at the roles that are important to you along your journey to help you find connection. We'll take a look at some of the attributes that are going to be important, but equally as important, some of the obstacles that you're going to encounter. And in the process, what I would like to contend is that there's an element for legacy. And when connection is formed, legacy can exist. And I'm going to contend that you have a strong heritage for that here. I feel very connected to being at this institution because my training was at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. If you look at our structure, which was closed in 2005 by Hurricane Katrina, you see a central unit, which was kind of the auxiliary services operating rooms. And on either side, patient care areas. Seems a little analogous to Emory, two medical schools, Emory, Morehouse, for us, Tulane, LSU. We all know that it started decades before with different breakdowns in the thing, but there are not many legacy hospitals in the country. So I am very excited to be at Grady talking to you coming as a charity hospital person. Another similarity that we share are about residency programs. The J. Willis Hurst program that you're a member of. I had the privilege last year of receiving an adjunct appointment from UAB as a professor in the Department of Medical Education to develop the Tinsley Harrison Legacy Project. And I'm going to show you some of the outreaches of that project in this discussion. But what you realize is that you with Dr. Hurst and UAB with Dr. Harrison really are exemplars of legacy. We could add Osler at the Hopkins program named after him. But y'all have people who were pivotally important. And if you can remain connected to what they stood for and not let some of the new things take you away from that, I think that you will serve yourself very, very well. So I decided to title this Finding Meaning and Joy in Medicine. Let me give you the basis for why we came up with that title. In 2011, there were a group of physicians who were brought together to look at how they could make training in internal medicine more enjoyable. And what they did was that they focused on the training environment and said that really it's about acquiring new knowledge and sharpening clinical judgment, and that there really should be time for those things to happen. But as you begin to look at your plight as a resident, we know that sometimes the daily routine of a resident doesn't allow that to happen. So let me take you about the way I see it. So there is pre-rounding, where you go through Epic and you find 10 years worth of notes, and then you've got to call a hospital to get someplace that doesn't give you the records. And then you pre-round so that you can get ready for your formal rounding period. And that's going to be kind of more in the chart, typing on a computer. Round start, you're about to get knowledge given to you. Your phone goes off, messaging goes off. You've got to go take care of a problem and you miss the education because you're dealing with the work. And then rounds finish and you're dealing with all the documentation and the discharge planning so that you can get to your compliance modules and all the Epic alerts. And if you think about it, it's a system that's just filled with things that take you away from knowledge and clinical sharpening. Necessary, but things that impair knowledge. The second element is about meaning. And this really, I think, is something worth looking at on your leisure. There was a YouTube done by Emily Smith a few years ago where she talked about the fact that we usually tell people that happiness is achieved with success and work. And so we start looking for that ideal job and the way to really do it. But she said what she found was that really left her feeling anxious and adrift when she was looking for just happiness. So she decided that it was important to find meaning, and she elucidated the 4 pillars of meaning. One is a sense of belonging. Belonging is connection. You're a part of something and you have to be connected to it. It is the pivotal element. I feel sorry for many of you who lost some of the connection over the years of COVID. It was something that couldn't be helped, but understand that connection, when it doesn't exist, can create some problems. There has to be a sense of purpose. You can look at a lot of the things that you end up doing and you can say, how does this really help me become a better person? But there's a purpose because it teaches you about important skills that you have to gain, about efficiencies that you have to develop, about the ability to look at something and say, I'm making a contribution and that has a purpose to it, even though it may just feel like work in the moment. Transcendent experiences, those times where you get above the hustle and bustle and work and you're able to have your sense of self fade away and you really deal with what's really important. We all have our transcendent experiences in different ways. Some people get it running, some people reading, some people cooking. It may be that you just take a long bike ride and just think. But you have to have these times for yourself if you're going to really find meaning. And then in a community like Emory, where the narrative competence felt to be so important, her fourth pillar is storytelling. And you've learned about storytelling very well through your narrative competence program. But what Emily Smith says about storytelling, it's a little bit different. This is the story that you tell about yourself. And it's the story about who you want to be. And then she uses this great line, it is your myth. You get to tell it the way you want to do it. And so when you have this ability to be connected and find purpose in the menial task, identify your transcendent moments, and then tell your story that is your own story, you will have meaning. And so we're going to take a look today at some of the ways that you might be able to find meaning and joy, and then also some of the things that may get into your way. During the time that I was on the ABIM board of directors, Catherine Lucy was the chairman of the board. Catherine is now the executive vice chancellor and provost at UCSF in San Francisco. And at the ABIM forum in 2011, she gave a talk where she had an incredibly insightful commentary. She says, in medical education, there are two things that occur. There are mechanics of care and there are mechanisms of disease. The mechanics of care are the things that you have to do. They're going to be always required, those things I talked to you about in the typical day of a resident. And they may not also feel very meaningful or joyful to you, but they are very important. And then there are the mechanisms of disease, that learning knowledge, that developing judgment, that is forming connection and having humanism, those categories and mechanisms of disease. That's what she said in 2011. If you read more contemporary literature, you might put some different names to this. You may say that the mechanics are transactional, and you might say that the mechanisms are transformative. But remember that your joy and your meaning is going to come from the mechanisms, probably not so much from the mechanics. So let's deal with the reality of a resident. How do you deal with that? Because you have to do the mechanics, and no one can take them away. You can take the most outstanding program director, and they can't make all the mechanics go away. So let me offer you this proposal, and it's really an adaptation that develops proportionality. So remember, if we have the ability to at least find some way to keep the good stuff in play, we might do better. I had the privilege during residency to have a mentor named Frank Griffin. And Frank was an infectious disease doctor who did his research at the Rockefeller on phagocytes, and then went to UAB and became a wonderful clinician. But in 1992, he gave a grand rounds on individualizing medical education. And in that grand rounds, he made the comments that concepts are lost in a morass of detail. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was my first introduction into proportionality. So think about what you did as a medical student. You studied over and over and over UWorld questions to pass step 1, 2, and 3. And you probably spent very little time learning concepts because there wasn't time to learn concepts because there was always another fact. This has got to be proportionality. How do we look at that in your today's world? You will hear all kinds of iterations of the 80-20 principle. It's sometimes called the Pareto principle. And if you dig way back, it starts in the late 1800s, where an Italian economist named Pareto realized that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. In 1941, there was an American engineer named Joseph Duran who said he was going to take this more to the world of quality and improvement. And he found out that if you look at organizations, 80% of the profit came from about 20% of what was being done. So I want to give you my modification of the 80-20 rule in the context of residents trying to find joy and meaning. I would say that 80% of your time is going to be spent in the mechanics. It's just what's required. It's the discharging and the epic and the compliance, and you have to do it. So how do you survive it? I think the way that you survive it is that you say, I'm going to make 20% the mechanisms, the joy. And I'm going to find 20% of things that I get to do that make me happy. And when that starts to be less than 20%, and I believe that number is an absolute, 19.9 doesn't count. You got to get it to 20. Then you have to say, I've got to take something out of the mechanics phase. And then it's your job to think about things that we probably do a little bit obsessive compulsively, a little bit perfectionistically, that we really don't have to do quite so much to give something to the 20%. I think you go to your program leadership and you say, I'm feeling like I'm not at 20. Can we figure out how to get us more to 20? But the proportionality is real, and it is because you have so many pressures on you to do the other things. As I have watched residents over the years, one of the things that I think is stifling is that numbers really beat you down. If you were to ask me as a 71-year-old man what my all-time favorite book is, I would have to tell you it is The Little Prince. I have a wonderful collection of every copy of the first printing and every color cloth that they ever did it. And my children laugh and go, what are we going to do with all of this? If you look in New York City now, Villa Albertine was built by the French government to welcome people who wanted to come study in different cities. This is their property in New York City. And in honor of the 80th anniversary of The Little Prince, they built this bronze sculpture in front of the villa. But what The Little Prince says is grown-ups love numbers. If you tell a grown-up about a new friend, they'll never ask you the important questions about what games does he play? Does he like sunsets? Does he collect butterflies? They're going to say, how much money does his father make? How tall is it? Or his brothers? They're going to ask him only about numbers. And if you think about it, most of what happens is we get a number. You have a step 2 score. You have, kind of things and milestones that are not exactly numbers, but it's along the range where it looks like a number. It's never about what are these qualities of humanism and professionalism and empathy that we do. That we like numbers because we can count something, and the subjective things that we don't count. To take it a different way, I'll take you to a 1934 novel that was based in New York right about Prohibition. It was called The Thin Man. And he said the problem with putting 2 and 2 together is that sometimes you get 4 and sometimes you get 22. And so if you become relegated to numbers, your chance for joy and meaning are not very good. So what we really are looking at is we're looking at an issue of plight. And if you think about plight, I believe it's really very important because I think that to understand humanism, you have to understand plight. So the humanities started in Italy in the 14th century. And if you look at that time at paintings or operas or literature or philosophy, it always dealt with the plight of something, of a person, of a group of people. And it was always an attempt to deal with plight. Then it moved through Europe through about the 17th century. In the 19th century, the word humanism got introduced into the medical vocabulary. And as we think about humanism, it's really dealing with plight. Well, we don't usually think about the humanism related to resident training, but it really is there because you have a lot of plights. And if you look at a lot of the plights that you end up having, those plights are related to things that strip away your joy and your meaning and stick you in situations where you deal with things like the mechanics. So understand that that's about flight. And I'm going to make the point, and I'll show it to you graphically in a few minutes, that the only way that you can really deal with flight in the right way is you have to have the courage to get outside of the box so that you can express humanism. If we think about humanism in medicine, there's one other corollary that I think is really important for us to think about. And it was written about by Tinsley Harrison in a 1970 article that he published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. This was his speech that he gave as the recipient of the ACP's Distinguished Teacher Award that year. And he talked about two views of viewing medicine. He talked about Penelope, who was from Greek mythology. She was the mother of Telemachus. And he talked about Pollyanna, the Haley Mills character from the 1960 Disney movie. And Pollyanna is meeting Penelope, and Penelope is idealistic about how it ought to be, and Pollyanna said, but it's the new world, and this is the way it is. The new world is the epic, and the old world is the Hippocratic Oath. And we're trying to take those things, and that's what Tinsley Harrison did in this talk. But he said something really important, and in that project we're doing at UAB, we captured this in a bronze sculpture that hangs on the wall outside the resident conference room at UAB. This is that iconic image of Tinsley Harrison. And what you see is you see a tree with three roots. This sculpture is 42 inches tall, it's 16 inches wide, it weighs 100 pounds, and it sits on the wall, and it addresses the concept of the roots of the medical tree. The youngest root and the least shallow root is the science. That's what we talk about the most. The intermediate root is the art. But Harrison said the deepest and the oldest root, going back 5,000 years to the Egyptians, is the priesthood of medicine. And what becomes very important is in the priesthood, the physician is the treatment. And so as you begin to look about joy and meaning, remember, you become the therapy, not your body of knowledge, not your skills at the bedside, you, the person, or the priest. And so when it gets to be overwhelmingly difficult, what you ought to think is that you are the priesthood. So as we begin to look at all these concepts and we begin to look at things about the Emory internal medicine program and how do these things really become unique, y'all have something that I've never seen before. And when I heard about it, I thought, wow, that is very interesting. And so what I would like to do is I'd like to spend the remainder of our time deconstructing this really unique element. And the really unique element is the sticker. You go around and what you find in call rooms, in workup rooms, in patient care areas is you find this sticker, and the sticker says, you've got this. Well, what you can imagine is this is Karen Law and now ringing in your ears going, all these things about joy and meaning, they're important. You can do them. We want you to have them. So we're going to deconstruct the Karen Law sticker. To do that, we have to talk about mentoring. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know the derivation of the term mentor? It goes back to Greek mythology, and it goes back to Homer in the 8th century BC. Odysseus was going to go fight the Battle of Troy, but he had a wife, Penelope, that was in that story that I told you about with Harrison, and they had an infant son named Telemachus. And so Odysseus was worried that they would not be taken care of. So he looked for somebody old and wise in the community that he felt like would be able to provide counsel and guidance and protection. And the old man that he found was named Mentor. And so he appointed Mentor to watch over his household and to guide his beloved son Telemachus, who at that time was an infant. In 1699, a priest trained by the Jesuits wrote a book called The Adventures of Telemachus. I won't say it in French because I would really mess that up. But anyway, it was the modern day account of the story of Mentor in Telemachus. And that's kind of what some people know about when they think they know about that. So let me share with you how this is often a little bit misinterpreted. I'm going to take you to the New England Journal and this paper that was published February of this year. What is a mentor? And this is the quote. Mentor is Athena, the goddess of wisdom, disguised as an old man who assures young Telemachus that he's more capable than he realizes of managing his father Odysseus's chaotic household while Odysseus is journeying home from the Trojan War. The New England Journal. Not completely true. Partially true, but not completely true. So if you go to mentoring and you look at the Odyssey, Mentor, over the 20 years that Odysseus was at war, made a mess of the household. He was a terrible overseer, and it became very chaotic. As Telemachus got older, Telemachus didn't have anybody watching over it. But Athena in Greek mythology was the goddess of wisdom, and she said, I need to take over and fix this. And she said, but I don't want to upset people by making them think that I'm doing it. So what she began to do was she began to assume the form of mentor. And so if you read the Odyssey, Mentor's name is mentioned 19 times. His appearance only happens 6 times, and in only one of those is he really mentor. The other times he's Athena, but sometimes in the beginning he's mentor. So we realize that people will sometimes make these statements about mentoring that are not really very accurate. Most of what we refer to in mentoring today as mentor being the figure that we think, not Athena, comes from the 1699 book, not talked about in the New England Journal paper. So it's partially correct, but without true historical significance. We need historians in medicine who can keep things straight. So this is the trilogy that I want to share with you. So who really is mentor to look over? Realizing that sometimes mentor is Athena. So if you look at the image to the far left, this is from a book from the 1700s, The Adventures of Telemachus, when it was republished. You see a man to the left who is Nestor. Nestor happened to be a friend of Odysseus, and they had fought in battle together. In the middle, you see Mentor with an olive branch, but Mentor is truly Athena then, and we know that from the Odyssey. And then to the right, you see Telemachus. So we see Mentor in the form of a man. The middle figure is done in 1808 by an Italian artist. It now hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. And what you'll notice is that Mentor and Telemachus are in the sea because Mentor was misbehaving. So, Telemachus was misbehaving. He gets pushed in the sea, but Mentor goes after him because he can't abandon him. But I want you to look to the left of Mentor, and what you see is an owl. The owl is symbolic of wisdom. That's the marker that really is Athena in the form of Mentor. And then sometimes we get really clear visions all the way to the right. What you see in the middle is Athena or Minerva, not acting in the role of mentor, but not assuming his image. What this says to us is that we can have all kinds of people mentor us, and they can come in all kinds of forms. And it really doesn't matter if they conform to the stereotype of what a mentor is or what a mentor is not. What we need is that person who provides wise counsel and protection. The image to the right is from a book that was published in 1785, and it seemed only appropriate that that copy now belongs to our honoree. There are some foundational elements of being a mentor, and let me warn you about these because this is where residents get into trouble. You start a residency and your program is going to say, and I'm not saying yours, my program does this, they just start matching up a name with a resident. That's going to be your mentor. The assumption is they're going to teach you how to get some research projects, how to stay online for a fellowship, how to begin to look for a job. And if you look at what most of those roles are, they are professional roles. And that's important, and you need people to mentor you there. What you also need are people who mentor you personally. People who remind you that you are good enough to be who you want to be, that there's more inside of you than you can probably bring out by yourself. And if you find a mentor that doesn't work in that personal arena, then go find an additional mentor who can do that for you. Because when you do that, you change the transactional relationship, the professional one, into more of a transformative one. I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I suspect very few of you have probably had a truly personal mentor who helped you really believe that you were as good as you were. Yeah, I kind of dished that New England Journal paper a little bit because I don't think they were very accurate about the way they wrote about Athena. But there was one line in that paper that I absolutely love, and I think it's really at the core of what mentoring is. It said a mentor is someone who has more imagination about you than you have about yourself. They're the person who believes that you are better and more than you can be. You're good enough and you're worthy and you can do this. And you may be scared, but it was like when Mentor pushed Telemachus into the sea. I'm coming right in after you. And it may be tough water, but if I push you in the sea, I'm going in with you afterwards. It's my favorite image in all of those books that he ends up doing. And then I want to share with you what I think is one of the real plights that if you understand it may prevent you from getting bitten by it. In some literature published in the 1970s, the comment was made that the mentor is really a transition figure whose role is to help the younger person realize the dream. So what that means is when the dream is realized, you get your fellowship, you get your job, you give up the mentor. Don't let that happen. Make the role of the mentor to make you the best version of you can be. And that goes further than the fellowship. Very few people hold on to these dear mentors that they had because subconsciously the dream was realized, or so they thought. Reframe the dream to be the best version of you. And if that person continues to help you to be the best version of you, then that will work. In the course of putting this talk together, I blind emailed one day a woman who has a PhD in Greek classics. Her name is Mada Dova. She got her PhD from Harvard. She teaches now at Holy Cross. And she has been a treasure trove of knowledge. I have learned more about mentoring in the last week than I have in the last 15 years that I've been studying it. But what I came to find out was that she had done an interview in this podcast where a group of people with Disney and Marvel were looking at superheroes from action movies and what happened with those super movies. And in the portion of the podcast that Mada did, she made a comment that I think captures Residency more beautifully than any way I've ever heard it. She said, for a hero to develop, there must be a failure that is evidence of effort, evidence of trial, evidence of inexperience. Otherwise, the hero cannot evolve if he does not demonstrate indirectly the difficulty of what he is called to accomplish. Sound like Residency? It's hard. And you're asked to do a lot of things that are really difficult. And you're not going to be successful all the time, but you've got to be able to do those things. So I've not done original research in my career. I've been very lucky that I started in the old days when you could kind of get by without having to do that. So I'll share with you the one original thing that I think I have created at the end of my career. And it starts out with a box. And I think that most residents and most people in general live in a box. It's safe. You're not going to fail. You're not going to get hurt. Not a whole lot of room where you can grow. We would love to get you out of the box. And this first ring that you're seeing is what I call the societal norms. And as long as everybody will not look at you like you're crazy, you might get out of the box and go into that ring. But again, it's still a little bit constraining because you're dependent on everybody else agreeing with what you're doing. What I contend is that there's a second ring that is further out. I've never been able to figure out exactly what you'd call this. For now, I'm calling these the moral boundaries, the absolute right and wrongs. But notice that there's a huge difference between the first ring, first circle, and the second circle. And if you begin to look at that second ring, I'm going to contend that's where all the really meaningful stuff happens. Society may not understand it all. They may look at you like you're crazy, But if you're going to develop really good things, it's going to be there. There's a 13th century poet named Rumi who put it like this: somewhere out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I will meet you there. To me, the Karen Law sticker says, I'm in the second ring. Come out here and meet me. One of the things that keeps people from going into the second ring is their unwillingness to be vulnerable. And in today's world, if you talk about vulnerability, you have to talk about Brene Brown. As of yesterday, her TED Talk had 55 million hits on this, and the YouTube site had 21 million hits. So 86 million views of this vulnerability talk. It's well worth the time that you would take to take a look at it. But let me condense it for you into these three elements. She says vulnerability, for it to exist, has to include courage. And the courage is to be imperfect. We live in a world that almost tells you you're supposed to be perfect. It's not an attainable goal, the courage to be imperfect. There has to be compassion. And what she says is that you cannot be kind to others until you're kind to yourself. And we often have trouble being kind to yourself. And the third is connection, going back to the very beginning. And it's the connection to be authentic, not to be the person who other people think you should be, but the person who you really believe that you are and that you want to be. And that becomes vulnerability. In our medical education building, we have this piece of art done by the man who did most of the art in Charity Hospital, Enrique Alferez. It's 6 feet tall, and it shows a child sitting on the lap of a mother. I bought this for our building because to me, it reflects a learner sitting on the lap of a teacher. And there's that physical intimacy of being that close that creates a sense of uncomfortableness. It's vulnerable. But if you think about it, if you recreated that scene in your mind, if the vulnerability didn't get violated, then trust would form. And if trust would form, then you can be guided. The piece was called Lygia, the guide. And what it essentially conveys is the message of vulnerability leads to trust, leads to the ability to be guided, and that can end up being, important. The second thing that you have to have in order to get into the second ring is you have to have grit. And Angela Duckworth is really kind of the master of writing about grit. It is that ability to have perseverance at the same time with passion. The interest has to be nurtured. The practice has to be repetitive and in areas where you're weak. The purpose has to be something that you value, and you have to believe enough in it that you do it. We were talking earlier today about Fred Cerise, and Fred Cerise was a student of mine. He was Colin's colleague at Parkland. And Fred Cerise recently sent me a note where he talked about encouragement. And I want to share it with you because it's something that every resident needs to know that you're entitled to and that you need. Encouragement during the early years is crucial because beginners are still figuring out whether they want to commit or cut bait. The best mentors at this stage were especially warm and supportive. Perhaps the major quality of these teachers was that they made the initial learning very pleasant and rewarding. At the start of an endeavor, we need encouragement and freedom to figure out what we enjoy. We need small wins. We need applause. My favorite part is we need applause. We need to be told we're doing well. We often don't get applause. So if you feel like you need it, know that that's normal, it's healthy, and if you don't get it, it's maybe maladaptive. Very important that we get encouragement. So what happens if we don't get out of the box and into the second ring? We run the risk of developing the imposter phenomenon because we're going, well, maybe we're not good enough. The Mayo Clinic published this in November of 2022. And what they essentially said, if you look in the second sentence of the conclusion, that physicians have more frequent experiences of disappointment in accomplishments than other people. So we're in a profession that sets us up. But why is that? Because the people who make it to this point generally are perfectionists. And nobody has told us about perfectionism. If you go back to that literature from the 1970s, they call it normal versus neurotic perfectionism. Most of us have neurotic perfectionism. We've now made that a little bit more politically correct. We call it adaptive versus maladaptive perfectionism. But it says that we probably want to do too much. It's why in the mechanics of care, we often go more than 80%, because we have this perfectionism that says we've got to do it right. And if we're going to make a sacrifice, we're going to do it to our own detriment. Their conclusion, and this is important, is leadership goes to fight with other leadership. Imposter phenomena could be treated by de-emphasizing our professional identities and taking comfort in knowing that our real impact is based not on titles and recognition, but on how we cultivate kindness and enhance the lives of other people. It's not just a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. When I was an intern in 1977, there was an article that was circulated around UAB. It came from this publication, Humanizing the Process of Medical Education. It was written by a guy named Stephen Levinson, and his essay won one of the prizes, and it was one of the 5 printed in this booklet. And what he said is the title of his Self-Contradictions of the Humane Profession essay was this: the sad paradox is that a profession supposed to care so much for people has somehow forgotten how to care for and nurture its own. It's the plight of every academic institution, not just medical. The law people will tell you, the business people will tell you, we don't nurture very well. But in a humanizing society, nurturing becomes really important. So if we really now think about what you've been seeing for several years, and we think about the Karen Law sticker, she's a mentor who says, I have more imagination about you than you do, so I'm going to make sure you're okay. And I'm not going to let you stay in the box. I'm going to push you into the second ring. And I know this vulnerability is not going to be comfortable, but I'm going to teach you how to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I want you to have the resilience that we're going to fuel by our applause to give you grit. And we want to temper your self-doubt so that you don't have imposter phenomena. The nurturing says that we've got this. So if we were going to think about how we close this piece down, and we kind of look at what has now become an integral part of your culture, and what I believe is really fundamentally important if you're going to have meaning and joy, I'd like to take you to a concept that I think is best represented in 3 ways that I call the head-heart trilogy. We had an international elective in our program from 2007 to 2012. And we let every second-year resident go abroad for a month to study something in a liberal art that they thought would have applicability to the practice of medicine. I was able to pay the stipend out of the manship chair that I hold. Our hospital didn't have a lot of Medicare, so we didn't have to have a cost report. It was the perfect storm for something good happening. We had a woman who decided to go to Ravello, Italy, because what she had heard was that's where poets went before they died, looking for the meaning of life. And what she found in Ravello was that they had these little places called reflection coves. And a reflection cove would have a place to sit with a piece of philosophy over it. When they closed our public hospital in 2013, I asked the landscape architect to build us a contemporary reflection cove in our building. And so this is what she built. If you look at that, there's a bench. The bench is French. It dates to about 1830. And then on that, what she ended up having was a piece of philosophy. And this piece of philosophy is really the quote by Sir William Osler. It goes back to a 1903 lecture that he gave at his medical school. And he said, the practice of medicine is a calling, an art. It's not a business. It's something that's going to require you to exercise it with your heart equally with your head. And sometimes we get so caught up on the head that we forget. In 1974, Tinsley Harrison published this book. It talked about better health care through better medical education. At the UAB program, Lisa Willett was the program director for years, and there was a beloved cardiologist named Cecil Coghlan. And he used to be the protege of Dr. Harrison, who he called Chief. And he used to drive Dr. Harrison along. So another one of the bronze plaques that we had built as an interpretation of what I'm about to show you is this one. And it's the importance of heart. And you see heart over the head, you see heart over the thorax. It says it's more about heart, and it was the educational equation, E for education equals HH squared. Let me play it for you the way that Cecil Coghlan told it to UAB residents in June of 2012.
First stage is small. Second is big five. Stage small. Which says it. What you can transfer as knowledge from your head to the student. That's not so important. They'll learn it anyway. But H, that is squared. Because that is your part. And the most important thing is your heart. So H is.
And the third element of the Trilogy of the Heart goes back to 1979. 1979 was at the height of popularity of the TV show MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, with Alan Alda during the Korean War. The Columbia College of Physicians and Assistants asked Alan Alda to be the keynote speaker at their medical school address. And they said, we want you to do this because you are the best known doctor in America right now. He said, I'm an actor. They said, but you're the best known doctor in America right now. And after a little bit of going back and forth, he agreed to do the talk. It's wonderful, and you should listen to it in its entirety. But at the very end of it, he gives us an anatomical association that's not completely accurate, but is really very important. And he closed with this to the graduates. But there's one more thing you can learn about the body that only a non-doctor would tell you. And I hope you'll always remember this. The head bone is connected to the heart bone, and don't let them come apart. So what does all this get down to as we close this thing down? It gets down to you as a resident trying to find meaning and joy in residency. Go back to when you were first applying to medical school. You were idealistic. You believed in so many things. And then you come into the profession and you realize it's not an absolute science. There are a lot of broken portions. There are a lot of mechanics. And sometimes that idealism gets taken away from us. Let me take you back to Paulo Coelho's book, The Alchemist. And what becomes very important in this book is the concept of personal legend. So this is the passage about that. There's a young shepherd boy talking to a king. Why would a king be talking with a shepherd? The boy asked, awed and embarrassed. For several reasons, but let's say the most important is that you succeeded in discovering your personal legend. The boy didn't know what a person's personal legend was. It's what you've always wanted to accomplish. Everyone, when you're young, knows what your personal legend is. At that point in their lives, everything is clear and everything is possible. They're not afraid to dream and to yearn for everything they'd like to see happen to them in their lives. But as time passes, a mysterious force begins to convince them it'll be impossible for them to realize their personal legend. Sound a little bit like residency? Yeah. And so why it's important for you to find joy and meaning is that it takes you back to that idealism for you to have your personal legend. And remember, as I hope I have told you, it's not just about your head. It's not about being in the top quartile of anything or the best. It's about how well you begin to make the connections that make you and other people whole. I'm a collector and I collect copies of books that I like. I came across this signed thing from Coelho in a copy of a first edition, first printing. He said, listen to your heart, follow your intuition, and the universe will help. So why is a talk like this so important at a place like Emory? Because y'all have something at this school that not many schools have. What y'all really have at this school is you have a legacy. The legacy was started by Dr. Hurst. This is the picture that is on your website that celebrated what would have been his 100th birthday. But I think it's very iconic. And I think it's very iconic. We've talked a lot about heart, and we have a cardiologist that the internal medicine program is named after. But I show you these two pieces of literature from the business world, one from MIT, one from the Harvard Business Review. Stories from ancestors were designed to keep new listeners from repeating the mistakes of the past. Your narrative, of course, is incredibly important, but do like Emily Smith said, tell your story, the story of who you are, the myth about you, but we have to tell these stories or they will go away and we will forget people like Dr. Hurst. Future generations will benefit from those stories and they will become better. So in my deconstruction, this is the way I now see Emory. I see it as a place of legacy, and the legacy has been passed on to a new generation. And so now we end up having a program that's all about this whole thought of meaning and joy. So if I were going to develop a definition of humanism, and I think they're very difficult, my definition of humanism, inspired by what I have encountered reading for this talk, would be that humanism is the connectedness and the vulnerability to allow someone to exercise heart in greater proportion than head so that that person can become the treatment, the priesthood. And I think that y'all have had wonderful examples to do it. And every time you see this law sticker, I'd like for you to remember all of these messages. It's about all those things, but let it be about meaning and joy, and let it be about humanism and legacy. Thank y'all very much for allowing me the opportunity to come to this.
I'd like to open up to questions. I will quickly look at the chat as well, but if anyone in the room has a question, comment, feel free to speak up. Dr. Law.
I'm not here to listen to it. And here we are. And so incredible gratitude to the series. It's wonderful to talk about. I think I would comment of, I think the comment is context for this.
I don't.
That it was by a town student, town hall, to take lessons today. And it was height of this year. And we were all struggling to find ways to connect and find ways to joy. And I think we all, and there were many ways we were trying very much to connect. And Alan felt that one way to connect was to stealthily commission stickers and put them up all over the hospital, unbeknownst to anyone. And it started, our residents are one piece all over the hospital. I'm a part of something.
Yeah.
Because I recognize this person and the name. So, I constantly humbled by the sticker and the concept of this. And I love how much you tie that to the list. Even in this invited message, that the goal is to not talk about you or us, to about how.
Yeah. And if I can make a comment about that. So I love that this happened in crisis, but I'd love to say to the residents, don't wait for crisis to start looking for connection. It's a little bit like watching somebody in a tag team wrestling match. and the person has one shoulder on the ground and the other shoulder this far on the ground, and they're in the middle of the ring and they decide they need to tag somebody, it's not going to happen. We wait so often till we're in crisis. We should do all these things we talked about. And again, I use the things that are related, but again, they really are the core elements of my career that I've seen that really say what becomes very important. They just are exemplified. But again, don't make it always about crisis before you get all these things.
And for those who are on Zoom, there's no question. It was Dr. Law giving us the historical context of the Karen Law sticker that is visualized here. Lots of thanks in the chat, no questions there. We are about at time. If anyone has one more short question, we could take that. Oh, Dr. Akhtashev.
About mentorship,
One
Yes.
second for Zoom. So the question was from Dr. Akhtashev asking Dr. Karam if he can share some of his own personal mentorship experiences.
The best mentors that I had were the people who helped me get over my self-doubt and helped me to do things that I didn't think that I was capable of doing. Because we have a lot of imposter syndrome all through our life. I had an event 3 weeks ago where I went to something and was supposed to go to a reception and felt like an imposter and walked out and started walking to my car. So the best mentors I ever had saw something in me that I was too scared to admit that I wanted, because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get it and I didn't want to fail. So if I didn't say it, it was as though it didn't exist. But what they said is, I think you're just scared of failure. I think you ought to go try this. And then they stayed with me the whole time to do it. So my best mentors helped me overcome my self-doubt. False?
I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think mentoring is critically important.
Yeah.
Don't settle with one. Well, some different approaches. But the other thing that I think is meaningful for everybody there is sponsor. And the difference, a mentor talks to you. A sponsor talks about you. And it's not the person who, you're going to give your name out. When I get invited to a lecture, I say, instead of inviting me, run this by such and such. And I think one problem that I see, especially for women in medicine, there's a very good article that talks about how women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. You have to sponsor people.
Yep.
It's our role as the older spectrum. We really need to sponsor people. I think that's an important characteristic of this program is how we sponsor them.
I completely agree. But I think that's that advocacy piece where you see your imagination says you can go do this and I'm going to facilitate that. And I think mentors do that very well put.
And that was Dr. Del Rio sharing the important difference of mentorship and sponsorship. And possibly this will be one last question. So this is the group from the Atlanta VA, and they are wondering, what are you most excited about in integrating this humanism in your own home residency?
One of the deals that I have seen about humanism is we don't know how to define it, so we can't teach it. So it becomes observational and experiential. And so what I hope to do with this Manship Humanism project is to create a primer and a series of podcasts that really describe what it is and then give you some ideas of various things that you might think about doing that might be the embodiment of humanism. And then to watch if you told people how to do it, would it speed up the way? I've seen that happen in a few cases. We don't have time for me to tell you about those, but I know when you give somebody a specific something that they can follow, it is easier than them having to watch for years, trying to figure it out and then go there. The other deal I will tell you is don't get hung up in the intergenerational idea of mentorship. I have been mentored by many people younger than me. I have been mentored by residents when I was in my late 60s. All that a mentor does is to see something in you and give you the ability to believe it when you don't believe it in yourself. So there are probably many of you who've seen somebody and want to go up and go, you're wonderful. And I think if you would do this, you could be fabulous. But you go, oh my goodness, I can't tell you. But it's absolutely possible for a younger person to mentor an older person. And let me tell you, it's lonely when you get older because people don't assume that. So everybody just assumes, well, you got what you need. You don't need anything. We old people still need it too. So remember, don't let it be intergenerational and don't let it be stereotypical. There's no reason that says a woman can't mentor a man can't mentor a woman. We saw, if you look at the Athena mentor stuff, it started off as mentor, it evolved to Athena. In the end, it went back to mentor. And at the very end of the Odyssey, it was the friendship of Odysseus that made mentor believe that he was worthy enough to step in and create peace. And so this thing is in flux all the time if you allow it to be.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. We're out of time. Thank you so much.